first session for today, a fireside chat on AI and defense. And I'm pleased to welcome on stage Mr. Loutas, NATO's head of data and AI policy, and Mrs. Marietje Schaake, former member of European Parliament and now international policy fellow at Stanford High. Marietje, Nikos, welcome. Great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Opportunity to address the audience at the Athens Roundtable this year, and of course to be joined by Marietje.
So much. No, very happy to be here. So go ahead.
Thank you. Artificial intelligence is a key factor of change in the global defense and security landscape. It helps us strengthen our defense technology, and it also helps us make it more efficient and effective. And yesterday, there was a couple of times when the impact of AI in the defense and security domain was brought up. If we combine this with recent examples of the use of big data, artificial intelligence, and also other emerging and disruptive technologies in the war in Ukraine, we can very confidently say that we're no longer talking about an emerging technology, but about a technology that has already emerged. It's already being used. Artificial intelligence offers opportunities to strengthen NATO's technological edge and also our defense and deterrence posture. We're also very well aware that our potential adversaries and strategic competitors recognize this potential as well and the importance of these new technologies, and therefore invest accordingly. At the same time, it's also important to mention for us, and that's why being in events like the one of today is very important, is that AI is dual-use technology. It's being discussed thoroughly. I don't need to say a lot about it. This practically means that AI products and developments that are targeting civilian use cases could also be used for defense ones. Applications, for example, related to imagery analysis or natural language processing are really good examples of such dual-use uses of AI. In this light and in that context, NATO's AI strategy that was endorsed by allied defense ministers already a year ago, alongside the data exploitation policy, helps the alliance use our data as a strategic resource and adopt these new technologies at pace. It will also help us accelerate our digital transformation. What we're now busy doing is moving from strategy and policy to practice. We are working on integrating AI in an interoperable way to support NATO's three core tasks by investing, first of all, in significant cooperation between our allies, as well as with the private sector and academia. Equally important and significant are our investments in developing a capable workforce of NATO, both technical and policy-based data and AI talent, and of course, a secure and resilient data ecosystem along with the necessary cyber defense. Our AI strategy contains 6 principles of responsible use of artificial intelligence. Those principles provide the bedrock of our strategic approach. They relate to lawfulness, responsibility and accountability, explainability and traceability, reliability, governability, and bias mitigation. And these are really very important because they underpin the safe and responsible use of AI by NATO. For example, consider scenarios where NATO and allies will consciously put bias mitigation efforts in practice. This will seek to minimize those biases against individual traits such as gender, ethnicity, or personal attributes when our AI systems are used. Our principles are based on ethical, legal, and policy commitments under which the Alliance has operated and will continue to operate. And it's very important to mention that they apply across all types of data analysis and AI applications that we're engaging with. They provide coherence for NATO and with allies, noting that some of our allies are already very advanced in developing their own national best practices and their own AI strategies and principles in the context of defense. And the cases of the United States, the United Kingdom, and France are just 3 of the examples I could bring up. So this means that operationalizing our principles is for us much more than a nice to have. It's a strategic necessity to engender trust in the way we manage and use technology along 3 levels. Trust with publics. People need to trust the way NATO and the alliance use artificial intelligence, trust with innovators, because we're talking about a dual-use technology, and tech industry needs to be comfortable with the way NATO would be using AI for our own purposes, and of course, trust with our operational end users, because in the end, it is people who will be called to trust and use a technology in operational settings. In that context, operationalizing the principles does not mean, of course, that we are trying to put brakes on innovation. What we're trying to do is actually de-risk innovation, and we're aware that risks could realize. So in this spirit, it's just less than 2 months ago, on the 13th of October, allied defense ministers came together in Brussels, and they endorsed the establishment of NATO's Data and AI Review Board. The review board is our governance body for artificial intelligence. It will help build trust in the way we use the technology and guide efforts in the enterprise and the alliance. I'm going to talk a bit more later in our discussion about how this is going to happen in practice. It's very important to mention that this board provides a forum for allies to come together, share best practice, coordinate efforts, develop standards and guidance. And it's also very important to mention that this board is going to be a multidisciplinary committee of people. We will have there scientists, engineers, ethicists, policymakers, developers, because it's very important to have this 360 view of the technology to be able to govern it. So with that in mind, I would actually like to turn to Marietje and actually thinking of the purpose and the importance for us and the fact that international coordination is very high on our agenda. I'd like to ask you, Marietje, what are the implications of AI development in the defense sector for the democratic order in your view? How do you see growing tensions and polarizations between countries with significant military capabilities threatening international coordination and alignment? And what can we expect in the shorter and longer term?
Well, big questions for a short session. So let me try to answer very briefly, and then hopefully we can make this interactive. I think a lot of the points that you've touched upon, the need to have principles to guide the way in which AI is used, the way in which data is used, the way in which risk is defined, the way in which civilian technologies can end up being instrumentalized or bleed into military use or become a part of conflict. Think, for example, about the crossover between information warfare and cyber warfare. These are all questions that really touch on the core roles of state, the questions of mandates, oversight, and accountability. And I think one of the big challenges for democratic societies is to move beyond stating principles, ethics guidelines, and so on, and really anchoring this in rule of law based mechanisms with the proper checks and balances, with the proper oversight. And that is particularly important because there is such a reliance, and you mentioned it in your remarks, on the private sector. And so I think a situation that is not desirable is when it is companies that are at the front lines of making decisions, whether it be in the context of peacetime or wartime, or the very blurred phases that we find ourselves in increasingly. And that it's companies that are going to decide when, in the name of national security, there is going to be, for example, an operation launched to defend the networks, or when information about risk that a company can see is going to be shared with the public, or when an analysis is made and it turns out that it was not the proper one, some kind of pattern recognition didn't go well, who is going to inform the public, and how are we going to find out? So with a lot of these dependencies and new realities, I would say we see a gap in democratic governance, we see a gap in accountability, and we see a very ambitious private sector that is stepping into this space. And so if you ask me, what do I think needs to be done? It is rebalancing that relationship and putting the tech companies in their proper place within a rule of law based system. And it is particularly important, but it could be broadly relevant for all kinds of uses of AI, but it's particularly important when data is collected and analyzed and used in the name of defending the homeland, which at the end of the day is about defending our free and open societies. And so what we don't want is that in the name of defending our freedoms, we're actually quietly eroding them ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Marietje, for your intervention. And I want to actually touch upon what you mentioned about very practical and concrete actions. And I would be, I would like to give 4 concrete actions of how we're putting principles into practice, because this is really what matters. So first of all, within 2023, our Data and AI Review Board will be developing a first version of a responsible AI certification standard, considering existing standardization initiatives in the civilian sector. Second, our allies have approved a cohort of priority data and AI use cases. All those are currently being piloted, and this experience will actually help us understand better the implications and the impact of AI, and also what needs to happen for implementing and delivering responsible AI. Third, as I mentioned, we are investing heavily in enhancing the quality of our data. Things like bias mitigation, for example, are deep-rooted in data quality, but also making sure we have the right people to develop but also use responsibly AI systems. And fourth, and more and very important, to come to your point with industry, we're reviewing the way we work with industry, our partnerships with industry, going beyond the traditional defense ecosystem and reaching out to tech sector and innovators. We're building partnerships with them, and we're also launching initiatives such as the Defense Innovation Accelerator Network and NATO's Innovation Fund, which are aiming at bridging this gap between the defense ecosystem and the innovation ecosystem. That brings me to my follow-up question to you, Marietje, because of course one part is coordination, the other is what can we learn from other experiences, from past experiences, and there I'd like to understand if we draw upon your experience in cybersecurity, an area that is also very sensitive and also subject to international agreements, conventions, and binding instruments. What norms and what democratic safeguards should be created or fine-tuned to account for AI's disruptive potential in the area of defense?
Well, it's a great question. Let's start with the EU, where we see a very remarkable development. The EU, once again, taking the initiative to regulate AI, I think rightfully so, and the whole approach, the concept where higher risk applications of AI should deserve greater scrutiny, in the worst case, even bans, and then other less risky applications of AI do not need the same sort of higher thresholds of regulation. But the AI Act, which is what I'm talking about, starts off by saying that it won't deal with military uses of AI. And one of the reasons is probably because that's a national competence, and that's understandable. But at the same time, if it's not through the AI Act, then how are we going to get a common standard across the EU for the way in which the military uses AI? And that is important because in the whole field of international law, whether it be laws of armed conflict, humanitarian law, international law, for example, the whole question of sovereignty and when might sovereignty be breached when we're talking about online activities, cyber attacks, as you mentioned. In that whole sphere, there is an enormous gap between the way the law was once conceived and the way in which technology challenges whole notions that are fundamental to international law, such as, how should we understand sovereignty? How should we understand territoriality? How can we ensure accountability, attribution being a famous challenge when it comes to cyber attacks? And so I believe EU countries and other democracies should not wait in defining their positions when it comes to how the next step in the interpretation of international law can be relevant and also enforceable in the context of new technologies, including AI. So I think the first and most urgent step is to really make those updates to how international law is interpreted, at least among like-minded countries, and then ideally globally and multilaterally. But of course, in the polarized and tense times that we live, this is not going to be easy. But I do think it is urgent because, again, what I think is a bad development, one that we continue to see, is that in a sort of gray zone, both offensive and defensive capabilities are sought and developed, again, often by the private sector. And the whole notion of oversight, transparency, learning in the public interest, holding to account those actors that are engaged in undertaking these activities is getting lost. It's getting buried. Sometimes it's even promoted as a strategic step, right? That we're going to have ambiguity as a plan. And that may well sound like a clever move, but at the same time, if it means that there is no oversight and that there is no clear mandate, for example, for these activities, then I think we find ourselves on a very slippery slope that does not do justice to the promise of democracy. So I really hope that gap that I'm talking about, the gap in the application of international law and also the accountability gap, can be closed.
Thank you, Marietje. And I think on that note, we can actually hand over to Nicola for the next session.
Thanks a lot. Thank you both. I know it's a very complicated and hot topic. We have a lot on our plates, and indeed the UA Act and the Council of Europe Convention are not addressing that. So, and congratulations to NATO for starting this journey and this effort. It won't solve everything, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle. Thank you so much, Marietje and Nikos.